The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious because nothing important ever arrived on a Tuesday. It was sealed with red wax pressed into the shape of a crown, not the official royal seal, which had 3 points and a lion, but something close enough to make Captain Aldrich Voss stop chewing his breakfast and set down his bread. The envelope was addressed to him personally, not to the Royal Guard Division, not to his superior, Commander Harith, to him, to Aldrich, in handwriting that slanted left, which meant whoever wrote it was hiding something, or had learned to write from someone who was. He opened it with his butter knife, which felt both wrong and satisfying. Inside, a single sentence, *, the jewels are at Morn Estate. You already know this. You just haven't been told yet. *, Aldrich read it 3 times. Then, he folded it, slid it into his breast pocket, and finished his breakfast, because a man who panics before he eats makes poor decisions on an empty stomach. That was something his father used to say. His father, who had spent 30 years in royal service and retired with a bad knee and a perfect record. Aldrich had the bad knee. The record was still a work in progress. The crown's missing jewels had been gone for 11 months. Not all of them. Whoever had taken them was careful, deliberate, almost polite about it. 3 pieces. The amberline brooch, which had sat on Queen Margaret's collar for every formal portrait in the last 40 years. The Voss pendant, which was, and this was a detail Aldrich had never shared with a single living person, named for his grandmother, who had presented it to the crown during a border negotiation in a story he only half believed. And the Coldwater ring, a plain band of silver that looked like nothing and was worth everything because of what was inside the stone. 3 pieces. Taken from a locked vault in a locked room in a locked wing of the palace, between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning on a night when the guard rotation had been quietly, professionally scrambled. Not broken. Scrambled. Someone had understood the system from the inside. The investigation had gone nowhere in 11 months, which was its own kind of answer. Aldrich reported to Commander Harith that morning and said nothing about the letter. He asked instead for assignment to a routine property inspection, Morn Estate, he said, citing a neighbor complaint about unauthorized water diversion from a protected stream. Harith, who had the attention span of a man managing 17 crises, signed the paperwork without looking up. Morn Estate sat 40 miles east of the capital, in the kind of countryside that looks peaceful because nothing has happened there yet. Rolling fields, a long stone wall, an oak lane leading to a house that was large without being ostentatious. The architectural equivalent of a man who is trying very hard not to be noticed. The estate belonged to Lord Fenwick Call, who was 63, widowed, moderately wealthy, moderately connected, and almost perfectly boring. He served on 2 charitable boards and 1 land committee. He attended seasonal court events and stood at the edge of rooms. He was the kind of man who made investigators feel foolish for looking at him, which was, Aldrich had learned over 15 years, exactly the feeling to pay attention to. He arrived in a plain carriage with a single aide, a young woman named Sin who had transferred from coastal customs and had a talent for looking at things without appearing to look at them. Aldrich had requested her specifically. Harith had barely noticed. The gates of Morn Estate were open, which was the first thing. Not standing open, not lazy open. Open in the way of a man who had been expecting someone and wanted to signal that the arrival was no surprise. Lord Call met them at the front steps himself. No butler, no footman. He was shorter than his portraits, with gray at his temples and a handshake that was exactly firm enough. Captain Voss, he said, I received notice of the inspection this morning. I hope the drive was comfortable. Aldrich had sent no notice. He had told no one outside of Harith's office. He smiled and said the drive was fine. Inside, the house was the house of a man who read a great deal and traveled occasionally and collected nothing unusual. Books in the library were organized by publication date, not subject, which was odd. The sitting room had 3 chairs positioned toward a fireplace that had not been lit in some time, judging by the dust on the grate. The hallways were long and quiet and lit well, too well for a country house, with lamps at intervals that left no dark corners. A house without shadows. Aldrich filed that away. Lord Call guided them through the ground floor with the ease of a man conducting a tour he had rehearsed. The water diversion issue, he explained, was a misunderstanding. The stream in question ran along the eastern boundary, not through it. And he had documentation. Of course he had documentation. He produced it from a desk drawer without searching for it, as if it had been placed there that morning. Sin moved quietly through the rooms. She did not take notes. She never took notes during a first walk. She said once that writing things down told the house you were paying attention, and a house that knew you were paying attention rearranged itself. Aldrich thought that was probably not literally true. He wasn't entirely sure. On the second floor, there was a corridor that Lord Call walked past without narrating. Every other room had received a sentence. This was the late Lady Call's reading room. This is where I keep the estate ledgers. This was converted from a guest room after the roof repair. The corridor got nothing. Just a turn, a slight acceleration of pace, a topic change about the stream documentation. Aldrich stopped. What's down there? He asked. Lord Call turned. His face was the face of a man who had prepared for this question and was now delivering the prepared answer. Storage. Old furniture. The previous owner left a great deal behind when the estate was sold. We haven't had occasion to clear it properly. Mind if we take a look? A pause. 1 second. Maybe 1.5. Of course not. The corridor smelled of cedar and something underneath the cedar that cedar was working hard to cover. The doors on either side were plain, unlocked, and did contain old furniture, chairs with sheets over them, a dismantled bed frame, 3 trunks stacked against a wall. Aldrich opened the trunks. Linens, folded, old curtain fabric, a box of mismatched candlesticks. At the end of the corridor was a door that was slightly newer than the others. Same wood, same handle style, but the hinges were brighter. Recently installed, or recently replaced. This one as well? Aldrich asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. Lord Call had recalibrated. That one is locked, he said. I confess I misplaced the key. As I said, we don't use this wing regularly. Aldrich looked at the door. The door looked back. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, and the sound moved through the walls like something trying to escape. No trouble, Aldrich said. We'll note it in the inspection report and arrange a follow-up visit. Standard process when a room can't be accessed. He smiled. Gives you time to locate the key. Lord Call smiled back. 2 men standing in a corridor, both smiling, both knowing exactly what the other was not saying. Sen, behind Aldrich, had stopped moving entirely. She was looking at the floor near the locked door. Then, she looked up. She said nothing. She would tell him in the carriage. They finished the inspection without incident. Lord Call offered tea, which they declined. He walked them back to the front steps with the same ease he'd shown at the beginning. Easy and unhurried. A man with nothing to hide so thoroughly performed that it required a great deal of preparation. In the carriage, moving back down the oak lane, Sen said, the floor in front of that door. The boards are newer than the rest of the corridor. Replaced recently. And there's a ventilation gap cut into the baseboard that the other rooms don't have. Aldrich looked out the window at the fields rolling past. Climate controlled, he said. For something that needs to stay at a consistent temperature, Sen said. Not furniture. Aldrich thought about the amberline brooch, which was set in a particular kind of amber that cracked in fluctuating temperatures. He thought about the cold water ring, whose stone was sensitive to humidity changes. He thought about his grandmother's pendant, which he had never actually seen in person, only in a painting, hanging at the throat of a queen who had been dead for 30 years. He thought about the letter. Asterisk, you already know this. You just haven't been told yet. Asterisk, someone had sent him here. Someone who knew the jewels were at Morn and wanted them found, but did not want to be the one to find them. That was its own question, sitting behind the first one, patient as a creditor. The estate disappeared behind a hill. We go back, Aldrich said. When Lord Call has had enough time to believe we're not coming back. Sen nodded and pulled her coat tighter against the evening air coming in through the carriage window. Outside, the countryside continued its performance of peace. The road curved. The light changed. Somewhere behind them, in a house without shadows, something waited in a locked room behind a door with bright hinges, in a climate carefully maintained, on a Tuesday that had already proven itself more important than Tuesdays had any right to be. Aldrich pressed his hand once against his breast pocket, feeling the folded letter. He already knew. He just hadn't been told yet. And in 11 months of investigating the wrong rooms in the wrong places, asking the right questions to the wrong people, filing reports that went nowhere and led nowhere and proved nothing, in all of that, no one had ever sent him anywhere useful. Until now. The question was not whether the jewels were at Morn Estate. The question was who needed him to find them, and why now, and what happened after he did. Those were 3 different questions, which meant 3 different answers, which meant at least 3 different people involved in something that had started 11 months ago in a locked vault, and had somehow arrived at a Tuesday, a butter knife, and a letter sealed with almost royal wax. He'd had worse starting points. The carriage rolled on. The fields darkened. The oak trees of the lane shrank to a dark line in the distance, and then disappeared entirely, swallowed by the ordinary evening. And Aldrich Voss sat very still with his hands on his knees, and his mind already inside the locked room at the end of the corridor, turning over everything he could not yet see. They went back on a Thursday, which Aldrich chose deliberately, because Lord Call would expect a return on a Monday. Official, scheduled, announced. A man like Call planned around official things. He left gaps at the edges. Thursday was a gap. Aldrich brought 3 people this time. Sen, as before. A locksmith named Orvith who had worked for the guard for 20 years and could open anything that had been made by human hands and had opinions about everything that hadn't. And a woman named Priest, which was not her real name, who specialized in documentation fraud and had a memory that stored visual details the way a library stores books, organized, indexed, retrievable on demand. They did not go to the front gate. They did not announce themselves. The eastern boundary of the estate ran along the stream that had been cited in the inspection request, the same stream Lord Call had documentation for, the same documentation produced too quickly from a drawer that had been too ready. The stream crossed under a stone arch in the boundary wall, wide enough for a person moving carefully, and Sen had noted the arch during the drive-in on Tuesday, which was the kind of thing Sen noticed. They crossed before dawn, in the dark gap between moonset and the first pale suggestion of morning. The estate grounds were still. Dew on the grass. No dogs. Aldrich had expected dogs, and their absence was louder than their presence would have been. A man with something hidden prefers not to have animals that react to the presence of the thing. The house was dark except for one window on the ground floor, left side, which showed the amber smear of a lamp turned low. Someone was awake, or someone had left a lamp burning. Aldrich did not enter through the house. They went around the back, along the wall, through a service entrance that Sen had photographed in her memory from the first visit, and described to Orvith in enough detail that he found the lock mechanism without a light source, and opened it in under 4 minutes, working purely by feel, and 40 years of accumulated understanding of how people lock things they want protected. Inside, the kitchen, cold and still. A hallway. The back stairs, steeper than the main staircase, built for servants who were meant to be invisible. They moved up 1 floor and turned east, and the corridor was exactly as they had left it. Chairs under sheets, trunks of linens, the end door with its bright hinges sitting in the dark like a thing that was pretending to be ordinary. Orvith looked at the lock for a long time without touching it. New, he said, barely sound. 6 months, maybe 8. Good quality. Whoever installed it wasn't cheap. Can you open it? He looked at Aldrich with the expression of a man who had just been asked if water was wet. He opened it in 7 minutes. The mechanism was good. Orvith was better. The door swung inward. The air that came out was different. Not cold, not warm. Precise. The way air feels in a room that has been engineered to feel a particular way. And, underneath the precision, something else, something old and mineral and faintly metallic, the smell of very old things kept carefully alive. They went in. The room had been a bedroom once. The bones of it were still there. The dimensions, the position of the window, now covered with heavy curtaining that allowed no light in or out. But the furniture was gone, and what replaced it was not furniture. 3 walls had been fitted with shallow display cases, the kind used in museums, glass-fronted, temperature-sealed, with small interior lamps that came on when Aldrich pressed the switch beside the door. And there they were. Not just the 3 missing pieces. Not just the amberline brooch and the Voss pendant and the Coldwater ring, sitting in their individual cushioned mounts as if they had always lived there, as if Morn Estate was their natural home, and the royal vault was the temporary arrangement. There were more. 12 pieces in total, displayed across the cases with the careful attention of a person who loved them, or who had loved someone they belonged to, or both. The line between those things was narrower than it appeared. Aldrich stood very still. Priest was already moving along the cases, her eyes tracking each piece, filing them. She would be able to describe every item in complete detail for the next 30 years without effort. That was her gift, and, also, she had mentioned once, the thing that made it impossible to forget anything she'd ever wanted to forget, which was its own particular weight to carry. Sen was at the window, not looking out. The curtain was too thick for that. Looking at the curtain itself, at the rod, at the way the fabric was pinned. It's been sealed from the inside, she said. And outside. Whoever uses this room doesn't want light getting in, and Doesn't want light getting out. Someone uses this room, Aldrich said. Not a question. Sen pointed to the floor in front of the central case. There was a chair positioned there. Plain, cushioned, angled to face the brooch specifically. On the small table beside the chair, a glass with a dry ring at the bottom. Someone sat here. Someone sat in this chair in this sealed room and looked at these things regularly and at length. The portrait on the wall stopped him. He'd walked past it when he entered, registering it as decoration, as background. His eyes came back to it now and stayed. It was a formal portrait, large, in a gilded frame. A woman in court dress, middle-aged in the painting, dark-haired, with a composed expression that could have been kindness or could have been iron discipline, depending on the light. Around her throat, the vase pendant. Not a painting of the queen. The queen had worn the pendant, yes, in official portraits, but this was a different woman. Aldrich did not recognize her from any official record. But the pendant was exact, every detail accurate, the chain and the central stone and the particular class design that his mother had once described to him when she told him the story, the half-believed story, about the border negotiation and the woman who had offered something irreplaceable to keep two countries from going to war. His grandmother. He was looking at a portrait of his grandmother, in a locked room in a private estate 40 miles from the capital, surrounded by stolen jewels. He kept his face neutral. He was very good at keeping his face neutral. 15 years of practice, and the specific kind of upbringing that teaches a child early that what you show and what you feel are two separate decisions. He looked at Orvith. Photograph what you can remember. No physical documentation tonight. Why tonight specifically? Orvith asked. Because we're not taking anything, and we're not making arrests tonight. Aldrich looked once more at the portrait, at the woman who had given something precious away to prevent something worse, whose name he barely knew, who was hanging in a room full of things she no longer owned. We're gathering information. We're not ready for what comes after. What comes after? Sen asked. I don't know yet. That's why we're not ready. They left the room as they had found it. Orvith relocked the door. They moved back through the corridor and down the service stairs and out through the service entrance, across the dewy grounds, under the stone arch and over the stream, back to where the carriage waited on the road with a driver who had been given no information about what they were doing and had not asked. In the carriage, heading back to the capital, Aldrich finally took the letter out of his pocket. He'd been carrying it for 3 days. He unfolded it again and read the single sentence. The jewels are at Morn Estate. You already know this. You just haven't been told yet. Asterisk, he had assumed this was sent by someone who wanted the jewels recovered. A loyal informant. A guilty conscience. A third party with something to gain from an arrest. Those were the obvious possibilities, and he was old enough in this work to know that obvious possibilities were the ones you checked last. What if the letter wasn't sent by someone who wanted the jewels back? What if it was sent by someone who wanted them found, and leaving it where they were found was not a failure, but the point? He thought about Lord Call. The practiced ease, the ready documentation, the prepared answers. A man performing innocence is one thing. But there was something underneath the performance that Aldrich had felt in the corridor and, now, sitting in the dark of the carriage, could finally name. Lord Call was not nervous about being caught. He was nervous about what would happen to the room. He was protecting the room. Not from the guard. From someone else. Priest, Aldrich said. She was sitting across from him, eyes closed, cataloging. She opened them. The 12 pieces in those cases. Do you have them? Yes. The 3 official missing pieces. Where were they positioned? She didn't need to think. The brooch was center left, eye level. The ring was bottom right, lowercase. The pendant was upper center, isolated. More space around it than the others. The pendant had more space. Significantly more. Aldrich looked out the carriage window at the dark road sliding past. The other 9 pieces, anything you recognized? Farrar from the royal collection. Older items, pre-Margan reign, not publicly listed as missing. They would have been in long-term storage. The remaining 5, she paused. I'm not certain of origin. They're old. Very old. One of them had a crest I didn't recognize. Could you draw it? She produced paper from her coat pocket and drew it from memory, in the dark, with the carriage moving, and handed it across. Even by the faint light through the window, Aldrich could make out the lines. A crown above a horizontal band above a name that had been worn almost to nothing by time on the original piece, but that priest had captured as best she could. He could read 3 letters of the name. VOS. The carriage moved through the night. Sen had fallen into a half-sleep with her head against the window. Orvith was turning a pick over his fingers, thinking about locks. Priest was cataloging. Aldrich looked at the 3 letters and thought about his grandmother, who had given something precious to a crown that was not her own, and who was now hanging in a portrait in a locked room in the estate of a man who Aldrich had been sent to find by someone who had not signed their letter. He thought about Commander Harith, who had signed the inspection paperwork without looking up. He thought about 11 months of an investigation that had gone nowhere, led by people who were very competent and who had found absolutely nothing, and about a letter that had arrived on a Tuesday from a hand that slanted left. Someone inside the investigation had been steering it away from Morn Estate for 11 months. And now someone, possibly a different someone, had steered it toward 2 forces, opposite directions. Aldrich in the middle, heading back to a capital where he would need to decide, very carefully, who he reported to and what he said, and what he kept inside his breast pocket until he understood whose side the information served. The road curved north. The carriage followed. Aldrich folded the paper with the 3 letters and put it in his pocket with the letter. Somewhere behind him, in a house without shadows, in a locked room at the end of a corridor, a portrait hung in the dark. A woman looked out from it at nothing. She had worn something precious to a negotiation and given it away, and whether that was sacrifice or strategy or love or grief or all 4 braided together, she had taken the reason to her grave, and the thing itself had ended up here. Aldrich thought he was beginning to understand why. He was not ready to say it out loud. Saying it out loud meant it was real, and real things required action, and action in this particular direction could end a career or end something worse than a career, depending on whose portrait it was you were about to connect to a theft that had been conducted with the inside knowledge of the Royal Guard. He pressed his hand against his pocket. The capital was 2 hours away. He had 2 hours to decide what kind of man he was going to be when he got there. He did not go to Commander Harith. He went instead to the palace archive, which opened at 7 in the morning for staff, and which was staffed at that early hour by a single archivist named Fun, who had been there so long that the archive and Fun had become functionally the same thing. You could not access one without passing through the other. Fun was 70, small, and operated on the principle that information belonged to everyone who earned the right to it, which was a philosophy that had gotten him into moderate trouble twice over a long career, and which he had never reconsidered. Aldrich arrived at 7:15 with 2 cups of tea, because that was how you arrived at Fun's archive. The Voss family, he said. Specifically, a woman. 40 to 60 years ago. Connected to a border negotiation. Possibly given or granted something by the crown. Fun looked at him over his tea. Possibly meaning you know, but want the paper trail to say you found it here. Possibly meaning I genuinely don't know, and need the paper trail to tell me. Fun believed him, or decided to. He disappeared into the stacks, which were his natural habitat, and came back 20 minutes later with 3 folders, and the expression of a man who had found something interesting and was deciding how interested to appear about it. The first folder was a land record. The second was a correspondence file, letters between the palace and a regional lord, 43 years ago, regarding a boundary dispute between 2 northern territories that had been moving towards something worse before it stopped. The third was a personnel file, which should not have been in the archive at all, and which Finn placed on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who had found it in the wrong place and chosen not to move it. The personnel file was for a woman named Maren Voss, designated in the record as a diplomatic facilitator, which was a title Aldrich had never seen before in royal service records. She had served for 4 years. Her service had ended not with retirement or dismissal, but with a notation that simply read arrangement concluded, 2 words that covered something without describing it. She had been given, at the conclusion of her service, a commendation and a property. Not money. Property. A house in the eastern countryside, 40 miles from the capital, granted in recognition of service rendered and not further specified. Aldrich read the property description. Morn Estate. He sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with something that has weight. Morn Estate had belonged to his grandmother. It had been granted by the crown. Lord Fenwick Call had purchased it, legally, on record, with documentation, 22 years ago, from an estate sale following the death of the last remaining family member listed in the record, a younger sister of Maren Voss. No children, no surviving heirs. Except Maren Voss had a son. Who had a son? Who was sitting in the palace archive on a Thursday morning holding a personnel file and understanding, slowly, the shape of something that had been assembled over decades by people who were either very careful or very desperate or both. The jewels in the locked room were not stolen. They were returned. He needed a minute to follow the logic all the way to its end, but once he started, it moved fast. The vase pendant, named for his grandmother, presented to the crown during the border negotiation. Except, presented wasn't the word in the correspondence file. The word used, in a letter from a palace official 43 years ago, was surrendered. She had surrendered it as a condition of the negotiation success. Not gifted, not donated. Surrendered, meaning she had no choice, meaning it was taken under circumstances politely dressed as voluntary. In exchange, a commendation. A property. 2 words in a file. Arrangement concluded. Someone, at some point, had decided that the crown owed a debt it was not going to pay. And so they had collected it themselves. Not chaotically, not impulsively, patiently, carefully, over what must have been years of planning, moving things out of a vault that the royal guard was supposed to be protecting, installing them in a house that had once belonged to the family from whom the most significant piece had been taken. And then, they had sent a letter to a man named Voss, with the specific instruction to go look. Not to arrest anyone. Not to recover anything. To look. To understand. Aldrich closed the personnel file, and pressed both hands flat on the table. Did you know? He asked Fun. Fun picked up his tea. I know where things are filed. I know what they say. What they mean is a separate skill, and not one I've cultivated. That was the most useful non-answer Aldrich had ever received. He left the archive and walked the long way around the palace grounds, through the eastern gardens, where the morning was cold and the light was the color of something not quite decided. He thought about the investigation that had gone nowhere for 11 months. He thought about the people who had run it, good people, competent people, who had nonetheless managed to never look east, never name Morn, never find a single lead that pointed in any direction that mattered. He thought about who had run the investigation above those good, competent people, and whose desk the reports had crossed, and who had signed off on the conclusion that after 11 months nothing useful had been found. Commander Harith, who had served for 30 years, who had been in the palace the night of the theft, who had signed Aldrich's inspection paperwork without looking up. Aldrich stopped walking. There were 2 possibilities. Either Harith was the one who had steered the investigation away from Morn for 11 months, protecting whoever had taken the jewels, or Harith was the one who had sent the letter, knowing the only way to get Aldrich to Morn without it being stopped was to send him there, without Harith's knowledge, which meant Aldrich's own request for an inspection assignment had been the cover, not the mission. He could not yet tell which. What he could tell was that both possibilities required the same next step. He needed to talk to Lord Fenwick Call directly, without official backing, without the armor of his guard title, and ask a question that would require Call to admit something in order to answer it. The question being, who told you to open the gate? Because the gate had been open when they arrived on Tuesday. Lord Call had known they were coming before Aldrich had sent any notice. Someone had told him, and the only people who knew about the inspection before Tuesday morning were Commander Harith and whoever Harith had told. He went back to Morn on Friday alone, in a hired carriage, in civilian clothes. He sent no advance notice. The gate was closed. Lord Call met him at the door anyway. Because of course he did. I expected you'd come back without the uniform, Call said. He looked different without the performance. Or rather, the performance was still there, but the audience had changed and so the show had adjusted. He looked older. He looked like a man who had been holding something a long time and was tired in the particular way of people who have held things carefully for years without being able to put them down. The room, Aldrich said. Yes. The portrait. Call looked at him for a long moment. Then, he stepped aside and let him in. They walked up to the corridor, and Call unlocked the door himself, without being asked, and went in first, and turned on the lights, and stood with his hands at his sides in the center of the room that smelled of precise air, and old metal, and time. Aldrich looked at the portrait of his grandmother. She sold this property, Aldrich said. The estate was granted to her, and then, she or someone after her sold it. Her sister sold it, Call said. After Marin died. The sister didn't know what was intended. She needed the money, and the estate was worth money, and so she sold it. He paused. I bought it because I was asked to. By whom? Call looked at the portrait. By someone who felt that certain things had been taken from certain families by the crown under circumstances that could be dressed up as diplomatic necessity, but were, in honest terms, coercion. Someone who had access to enough information to know which families, and which things, and which vault. He paused. Someone who is now very old, and is running out of time for the truth to still matter. Harith, Aldrich said. Call neither confirmed nor denied it, which was itself a confirmation. Aldrich stood in the center of the room, surrounded by things that had been taken and returned and hidden, and looked at the woman in the portrait who had given something away to keep two countries from tearing each other apart, who had received in exchange a title and a property and 2 words in a file, who had died without seeing any of this undone. The vase pendant sat in its case above and slightly to the left of where he was standing. He had never seen it in person. It was smaller than he'd expected from the portrait. In the painting it had the scale of something significant, but in reality it was modest, a small silver setting around a stone that caught the light and held it. He understood, standing there, that he was not going to file a report. Not today. Not about this room. Not about these pieces. Not about Lord Call. Not about whatever Harith had or hadn't done. He was going to go back to the capital and request a meeting with Commander Harith. Not official. Not in the office. Somewhere that didn't have walls that reported upward. He was going to ask Harith to finish telling him what the letter had started. Because the letter had said, *, you already know this. You just haven't been told yet. * he knew now. He just needed to be told, out loud, by a living person, with full accountability for what it meant. Why a 30-year career had been spent making room for a wrong to be corrected that the institution could not correct itself. Why a man who had served the crown faithfully had spent a decade, and more quietly laying the groundwork for a reckoning that didn't look like a reckoning, that looked instead like a locked room in a private estate with a chair positioned in front of a brooch and a pendant with more space around it than the others. Because someone had loved Marin Voss, or loved what she represented, or loved the principle of a debt that should be paid, and had spent the better part of their life paying it without any of the recognition that comes from paying things in public. That deserved to be said out loud, even if only once, even if only in a room without other ears. He looked at the pendant one more time. Then, he nodded at Call, who understood what the nod meant. Nothing changes tonight, not yet. And walked back down the corridor, and down the stairs, and out of the house, and into the afternoon, which was pale, and cold, and indifferent to all of it. The carriage took him back to the capital. Aldrich sat very still with his hands on his knees, which was what he did when he was processing something too large to move around in. He was a man who had spent 15 years believing the institution was worth protecting because it was worth improving. He still believed that. He also now believed that there were people inside the institution who had spent their careers quietly protecting things the institution refused to acknowledge it had broken. Both things were true. Neither canceled the other. That was the hardest kind of truth, the kind that didn't resolve cleanly, that asked you to hold 2 real things at the same time without forcing one to win. He thought about his grandmother, who had held a pendant to a negotiation and come home without it. He thought about what she had made possible and what it had cost. He thought about the kind of courage it takes to give something irreplaceable away for a reason that no one will put in the official record. The capital came into view, its towers pale against the evening sky. Aldrich pressed his hand against his breast pocket one final time. There was no letter there anymore. He had burned it that morning before going to the archive, which was the right thing to do, which did not make it feel like anything other than a small loss. But the words were still in him. * you already know this. You just haven't been told yet. * he knew. He was about to be told. And after that, after a 30-year man sat across from him and finished the story that had started before Aldrich was born, he would decide what came next. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon, carefully, with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. The carriage passed through the city gates. Somewhere in a locked room 40 miles east, a pendant sat in its case in the precise air, waiting with the patience of something that had already waited decades. Aldrich Voss was going to make sure it didn't wait much longer.